we are going to talk about visual aids. And I'm going to go through the different types of visual aids. We're at the top of the handout loosely. Mostly because at this point, I think that where we're going with the types of speeches that you're giving, they won't often warrant these other different little aspects that you could use for visual aids. For example, like objects. You're more than likely not going to be bringing in an object in this class, but we'll go over those in brief. And then we'll talk a little bit about the guidelines for visual aids that are more of the guidelines for the visual aids and the guidelines for presenting the visual aids will be both what you are graded on. However, some are more just standards for the preparation, and then the others are, of course, the standards for presenting. And then the last thing that we'll do is we'll go over a little bit of the technology, making sure that you understand what that box looks like, how to use it effectively, and then we can go from there. But visual aids have a huge purpose, and visual aids aren't simply something to take up time or, ooh, it's a requirement, so I simply need to have one. Really, I want you to think about how you can use visual aids as a supporting material. That's something that it can be most effectively utilized for, is supporting your ideas and bringing about better understanding. So there's three different types of, or three different reasons as to why we would oftentimes use visual aids. And so when we see here on the screen these different types of reasons for having visual aids, the first one here is for this idea of clarity. Visual aids are awesome because oftentimes when we're talking about something, we've explained it, or maybe we're using the words of an expert and we're using their words to explain what we're talking about. But still, we can't ensure that these big concepts or areas where our audience doesn't have a reference point is going to understand what we are talking about specifically. And in order to make that clear, oftentimes supporting it with some kind of visual aid is going to be incredibly helpful. So think about the purpose of clarity. That is one reason as to why we may use it. The second up there, I think, is interest is one of the other things. Let's be honest. It's fun to look at other things that are going on. And oftentimes when we're talking about it, it could not be half as engaging. But when we start to show you what it looks like or what that process is, or perchance we show you the experience of what people are having, now it becomes more engaging and it maybe even becomes more interesting and exciting for us to look at. The other thing is for the purpose of retention. So why do we say retention with a visual aid?
You want to stick with them.
We wanted to stick with them. And what types of learners do we have in the world?
Visual.
Okay, well, there are visual learners. Yes. So there's a lot of different types of learning that we can do, right? Like kinesthetic learning, auditory learning. Are you better at visual learning? Oftentimes, multiple types of learning styles are most effective for speeches that are complicated, for information that we're trying to present that may be difficult or maybe our audience doesn't have a full understanding of. And so a great thing to do is to build in a visual aid, as that can sometimes be the trigger that helps them remember and helps them to recall even what they're doing. So if you are more of a visual learner, it can help us in that way as well. The other thing that it adds to you is credibility. There was a study done years ago by the 3M company, the people who make Post-its, and what they had is they had individuals who delivered a speech without visual aids, and then they had the person deliver the same speech with a visual aid, and the individuals who watched the person with the visual aids deemed those people speaking to be more credible and more well prepared. Same exact speech, same exact style of delivery. One had visual aid and one didn't. So why? Why were they deemed more credible?
It just kind of brings your words to life, and you see it.
So if we think about something, what credibility is based on, right? Credibility has two breakdowns of it. Do you remember them? The first concept is compa. Tins. Good job, everybody. So in order for credibility to come through, one of the first things that we look at is this idea of competence, right? So is somebody competent? Are they well informed? Are they knowledgeable? Are they an expert on what they're talking about? And so a way to build your credibility would be to, of course, tell them I'm credible to speak about this, or to give you their qualities or characteristics or specific expertise that they have. But another way is to bring in this idea of showing a visual aid. So why does it make somebody's seem more credible, competent when they show a visual aid?
It has to do with like being prepared. Something like
It does have to be with being prepared, right? It took time to do what?
that.
To find the visual aid, to find how it supports, to help to illustrate and show your audience what you're talking about. The other thing that credibility is based upon, and these are two elements that we'll speak about like next week when we talk a little bit more about ethos, but in regards to credibility, it's not only competence, but it's also goodwill. Goodwill means the good intention toward our audience. And when we do extra steps to ensure that our audience is crystal clear on how our information is in fact true, it is correct, it's it here, let me show you exactly how this works, it builds in that goodwill. There's this idea of like transparency, if you will. I'm trying to show you all the ways that that this is possible, that this is truthful, that this does work. And so it builds that idea of credibility in a couple ways. And then the last thing, then it's just more persuasive. And why do we think it's more persuasive? It can be more persuasive in a million different ways, but why would it assist in the fact of persuasion?
Because you're more credible.
Okay, because you're more credible. So absolutely, being that credibility is a proof, if you will, if you think about the structure of Aristotle, right? That yes, when one is credible, their persuasiveness increases because of their believability, of their knowledge, of their competence, the investment that we have in whatever that credibility is.
Yeah, if you're like describing like a specific situation or a place, maybe like look what's happening here. Like, if you show a picture of that place, I mean, they now they know for sure you're not lying or like not exaggerating. I mean, a picture can still be somewhat staged, but like it gives a better like I don't know like a second opinion. I guess like they can directly like see it themselves and not like know that place just because of your description.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like I don't know. It's
Good.
kind of like a drawing in a book or in a children's book or something. Like
Absolutely.
it helps you kind of
Good, and that's absolutely it. Like, it really, this idea is that it's going to help us become more clear on why we're supposed to say yes to whatever you're talking about. Is that, like, even and when you're talking about issues of, like, maybe we're talking about a place, but maybe we're talking about a place in despair, right? And we're continuously talking. So, like, for example, if Megan was doing her speech in regard to, like, Boyle Heights, talking about Boyle Heights for Jonathan, and then we were talking about, like, what's that area up there? Like Fresno. That valley up there, absolutely. Where they've been talking about what the pollution looks like, or that there's pollution and people are getting asthma, et cetera. I don't know still what it looks like. And oftentimes, maybe if we were to see just the devastation, that would help us to take action. An individual just posted like the pictures from his house of the devastation of the camping fires as part of his not GoFundMe, but like something that he was doing money to raise, but being able to see that devastation rather than just simply talk about it and see it from that firsthand experience, not a mediated news that we're used to seeing about it or seeing something that you're familiar with, it really draws your emotions in. It makes it a little bit more real, and so it can assist in that persuasive nature. So this is the thing, is that we want to make sure that our visual aid has a purpose. That's the biggest concern, is that visual aids are oftentimes put up and put behind somebody, and then they're never talked about again. They're like, oh, here, look, I brought a visual aid, and hopefully I can get my points for it. No, it should have a purpose. And so behind me, you're seeing these different elements that it should have a purpose in. It should help to clarify. Maybe it's going to help build your credibility. Maybe it's going to help build the credibility of the source you're speaking about. Perchance, this is what's going to gain my audience's interest, and that's going to be what draws them to listen to these problems in the first place, or to even start engaging in a speech that they didn't have any interest in. So note that your visual aid should have a purpose. It's not simply something to put up in the background, but it should be there to aid in the development of your goals and of your speech. Whether you are speaking to 2,000 or to 20, the same rules are going to be taught, the same rules are going to apply. So know that you can take these throughout and for the rest of your collegiate career. Put them in your back pocket, and when you go out into the real world as well. So let's look really quickly at these different types of objects that we want to examine, or the different types of visual aids that we can look at. And I don't think, we'll just go like that, because you don't need to see what's already in front of you. So the first thing, objects, anything that is tangible. Remember that you can bring in different types of objects that your audience may need to be looking at. I've seen really fun, persuasive speeches that use objects before that we can, chat about in a little bit as well. But then we also have models. So models aren't maybe something that's too large to bring in. I can't bring in the Titanic. I can't bring in the Eiffel Tower. I can't bring in Alcatraz. But you know what I can bring in? A model. A smaller, scaled-down version that is to scale, like it's going to show everything that we need to. However, it's in a miniature, compact way that we can bring in for the audience to see. What I think that most oftentimes is utilized here as our time progresses, meaning as technology progresses, more people are just simply utilizing the use of the technological devices. And so utilizing photographs is one of the easiest ways to communicate your ideas. Individuals have already either, one, taken pictures of what you're talking about, or hopefully, especially with like journalism and the ways that it's done these days, you're able to find such amazing images, photographs, especially like even using stock images or different images to help illustrate and illuminate what you're speaking about. But photographs are a great way to really convey the meaning and help them to see and explain. We can also use drawings. If you're an excellent drawer, feel free to do so. If you're ever one of those individuals who likes to watch maybe like a YouTube video, and instead of having somebody sit there and talking, instead they have like little stick figures that are designing and doing what they're talking about. Have you ever seen those? Those always make it so much more fun to like listen to a little explanation or whatever. But if you are a great drawer, or if you wanted to draw something, you are more than welcome to do so. I'm going to skip over this graphs and charts for a second, and I'm going to go into video and audio. Audio and video are awesome ways to bring life to your speech, to also assist in the understanding of your speech. It is a rule that your audio and video should be no more than 30 seconds in length. So why no more than 30 seconds? What do you think is going to happen?
Because if it's a visual aid, I mean, people will just get bored because it's kind of always the same. And then if it's worth more than, maybe if you're doing something more than 30 seconds, then maybe it's maybe like a voice explaining something, and then it should be you making the speech and not the video. So.
Good job. Absolutely! That was exactly what we were looking for. Good! It's a one! It should be you doing the work. The visual aid, again, it's aiding your work. It should not be saying exactly what you are saying as well. Like, don't set that visual aid up saying exactly what the visual aid is going to say. Also, 30 seconds, anything longer than that, and your audience is going to start to become invested in the visual aid, and the transition back to the speaker becomes a little bit difficult. Also, we can oftentimes fall off track a bit, but it just becomes a little bit too long after that 30-second point for an audience's focus and attention to be focused and turning back in. So video and audio are great ways to illustrate what you're talking about. Also, there are great ways to show personalized testimony, because remember, hearing it from that person's perspective, from their experience, and in their own words, is going to be exponentially more emotional than you representing their experience. And although that's 100% fine for us to do, because not oftentimes people want to put themselves on camera or want to express that, but if we have the opportunity to do so, I would do so because of that emotional connection that you can bring to the audience. The other thing is audio. You can always play like music or sound clips or sound bites if you don't have the visual for it. So keep those in mind that you can always do it. And then multimedia presentations. Now, we don't use PowerPoint in this speech or any speeches, at least for just how I teach these basic classes. There's a great textbook that says real leaders don't use PowerPoint, and it's an entire speaking manual, but it's talking about the problems that come with PowerPoint. Each of us, since this is our chance to be able to speak about information, PowerPoint oftentimes can become somewhat of a something that people will lean onto so that they don't have to be so engaged with their audience, that they don't have to make that eye contact, so that they don't need to be necessarily so prepared. These are the images that come across when utilizing PowerPoint. We can use them effectively, but not oftentimes people are doing it in that way. I am more than happy for you to use PowerPoint in this classroom as a vehicle through which you show other visual aids, if that makes sense. So if you wanted to put like a picture on one and a graph on the next and a chart on the next one and put like blank slides in between, it's a great way to bring in those materials and have it all housed in one space for your presentation style. Also making sure that like things like links work and that they're correct or that they're already embedded into your multimedia presentation. And then the last thing here is the speaker, always being able to use yourself as a visual aid. Remember that if there's any type of practical speeches that you are giving whereby you can use your own body, you can use your own skills that you know or can demonstrate to that to the audience, the speaker is always a great way to also use yourself as a visual aid. So know that these different types of visual aids definitely exist. They are all available to you. There are definite ways to and not to use them. But before we go on to any of those type of guidelines, I'd like to first describe to you some of the different types of charts and graphs that we will be looking at because they are important. And you have to remember, I'm just talking because this is an example of visual aids, by the way. This is one of the lessons you'll learn. When your visual aid goes down, just keep talking. So what are graphs? So there's two different things. There's graphs and then there's charts. So graphs, they're there to show the statistical trends and patterns. And these are going to be very important for you, especially when you are bringing about different numbers to the audience. As you'll note, one of the guidelines down at the bottom is that if you have numerical data, to present it or to present subsequent support to that content utilizing a visual aid. Because people cannot grasp numbers as easily as a description or an explanation, we don't know what numbers look like or what that size looks like or what the differentiation looks like. And so putting it into some type of visual description can assist in showing what you want or pointing out what you want the audience to notice about those numbers. It can serve as an excellent tool for your warrant, if you will, that explanatory piece of why this evidence is important to the problem or why it serves to feed that problem. So if we're looking at these graphs, there's different types of ones that we can use. And the first is a line graph. So just knowing, and this is, most of you have learned this in something like 7th or 8th grade. You learned about what these graphs were, and you learned about how to write them, and you probably drew them with colored pencils or something like that. We don't want to draw our graphs in our charts. Of course, if you do need to create your own graph or your chart, you could do so in a program like Excel. You can even do it in your Word program or something else. But if the reason as to why I like to go over these is, one, to remind you what their purpose is. So if I'm looking to show a change over time, I would use a line graph. But also, what do we need to point out to the audience? Because our audience, we can't assume, knows how to read that line graph or what they're supposed to look like. We will always make sense of the visual aids that we put up. We can't assume that our audience can see. One of the worst things that we can say is, as you can see. Because one, we don't know if everybody can see. Now that's a problem. And secret option 2, your audience may not be able to understand what they're looking at, so we always have to explain it. So if we're looking at a line graph to show changes over time, and you can use it with one or more lines, what we start to see is that the bottom line is always going to be designated with like that time period, whatever time we're looking at. 5 a.m. to 6 p.m., great, but here's the timeline how it broke down, or you can do the years, months, whatever. Then, as it says up here, this is the percentage of personal spending. So we know here on this line, these are the percentages that we are looking at. And they're comparing two different things, healthcare and food. And I can only imagine what this graph what this graph is trying to explain. But let's talk about some of the things that you would need to explain. What are you looking at on this? Yeah.
The relationship between the two.
Okay, what's the relationship between the two?
As
As time goes on, in my head, I think that people are spending more on healthcare than they are on food because food is getting cheaper. This is just my idea. Food is getting cheaper, and when people buy cheap food, their health goes down, and therefore, over the process of time, maybe food has gone down, but their health problems have gone up. Does this make sense? It's kind of like that idea of like one of the causes as to why individuals like don't eat healthy. And most of the reason is like, okay, well, we can't afford these issues to begin with, then so we'll buy less cheaper food, but what we don't know is that the amount that they could have spent on more nutritious foods to prevent the health issue would have been a better choice fiscally. Does that make sense? But when you're in the area of like food disparity, you're worried about feeding your family, so really just call it a day. But good, what's the differentiation that we're trying to show? That would be on behalf of who? The speaker, right? A picture speaks 1,000 words. It actually speaks 0. Who speaks?
speaker.
Yes, you. Absolutely. It's just that same idea as if numbers don't lie. But people do, right? It is our responsibility to talk us through what this means and to show them how we make sense of it. Now talk to me about the percentages. What's the pickle here? And what may be something that you would want to point out to your audience? Yeah.
That the scale of the graph goes from 10 to 20, that's very misleading.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's, I mean, you should definitely point it out if you're going to do a presentation, because if somebody notices that, like I just did right now when looking at the graph, I say, okay, that's misleading. I feel misled, and I think that the speaker might have other motivation.
Good. Okay,
So
great. Fantastic.
credibility went down for me at least.
Good. Maybe, let's just say for the fun of it, before this, I showed you a pie chart. I showed you that students at LMU's personal spending is 20% of their entire income. Now, let's look at how that's broken down. Just let's see. That could help.
Yeah, but it's assuming that it starts at 10%. So it
Oh, good
changed.
call.
looks
So it's
a lot
only
bigger.
10. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It's a
Good.
smaller change than it seems.
Yeah. Nice. Good. All right. What else about those numbers over there on the side that you would want to point out? Because that line isn't at 10 and it's not at 15. Where's that line?
13.
Right. These numbers here, obviously that one is right there, but this number here is questionable. So it's important that we make sense of it. And then if they are, in fact, an even exchange by that time, that should also be pointed out to us. But these are key things that we should be looking at. Do I need to explain anything in these years or any changes or any issues that we've seen going on? Maybe they were going to point out the date that it all went down, that it all started to change, the year that it all started to change. Maybe there was something important about that for us to know. But simply showing these changes over time and being able to illustrate in this capacity what those numbers that I'm talking to about look like in visual form can simply assist the audience in making sense. But like you said, it can have the adverse effect if it's not explained, to if the audience is using the speaker's using the visual as a tool to manipulate in a little bit of a different way. And 3, if it's not fully explained and it does look like this idea of manipulation, it's going to definitely lower the credibility and your ability to be persuasive in some way, shape, or form. So the other type is a pie graph, which I just mentioned. And I always like pie graph because why? I mean, it looks like pizza, and it looks like pie, and it's so fun, and it's so easy to cut up, and it used to be the little Trivial Pursuit things. But essentially, it is the distribution of, it's when you want to show distribution. So line graph to show changes over.
Okay.
Great. And pie to show distribution. Good job, everybody. Okay, great. So here we're looking at women in the workforce, and what they're doing is they're showing a comparison between 1900 and 2010, and I'm not sure what we're trying to speak about here. But the important thing is that we're starting to see how these percentages are broken down. Now, again, women in the workforce where? Women in what workforce? In the U.S. workforce? I don't know. Is it a particular job that we're looking at? Also, what else do you notice about this that you would maybe want to know information about?
Because like in the 1900s, like the percentage of women that were in the workforce compared to the ones that weren't in the workforce, it was a lot less. So that only shows like of the women that were in the workforce. But you could also show maybe another graph that shows women that are in the workforce versus women that are not in the workforce. I don't know if I made that clear. Because maybe like in the 1900s, only like 10% of women were in the workforce. But
Gotcha.
right now
So
it's
what's the number that we're looking at here?
Yeah.
Is this, oh yeah, like out of a sampling of 100 women from the 1900s and 100 women, right? Like what do we know about the sample? Good. Very critical. What else do you notice about this image? And what makes it easy to, or pleasing to the eye?
Colors.
Okay, good. So the colors on here as well as the what? Anything else? Potentially the font is there? Okay, these are just things that you'll know for like later guidelines, but simply notice that. So if you're talking about distribution, make sure that you,
I have another
Good,
criticism.
I'm so proud of you for your
I
critical
think
thought.
pie charts you should only show them as a circle and like as a top-down view, not like a kind of like 3D view, because they can skew you towards the one that is in the front, and I don't think that's good at all. Because like if you see, it's not a perfect circle, right? So the slices of the pie are not equally distributed
Nice.
ish. So I think it's still a bit misleading showing pie charts like that.
Okay, great. Great. I love it a lot. So if you are showing the distribution, make sure that you are simply showing what parts of the distribution you want us to focus on. Oftentimes people will put up like an entire thing. So for example, Jacob, if we're talking about taking away from spending in military spending, in providing financially Medicaid through that, something if you wanted to look and, because I've seen pie charts like that before, or pie graphs, like that before, whereby it'll show the entirety of what like U.S. spending is on and what percentages we give. There will be like 500 different categories in that area. So it's important that if you have a bunch of information out there that you are really pointing out what you want them to look at in comparison to the other. So showing about how much the spending is used, how much it isn't, and look at how much this is used, and do we need those particular parts. So you can break it down even more if you want to. That's just an idea. So point out the distribution, point out what you want us to know. Is there an imbalance in the distribution that you want us to be aware of? Is there a a positive shift in the distribution, that if we did something like these are the results of what happened in another place and how the percentages were redistributed, or how funds were differently allocated, or how they switched things around to make a shift?
And then would you, let's say if you're like trying to say that something didn't do a good job, could you use them to show like the lack of change?
Absolutely. Because that could be something too, like they've only had, and it could sound great too, right? Like they've had a 45% increase over the past 10 years, but when we look at what that is, and then you can show, although 45 may sound good, let's take a look at what that really looks like. I mean, here's the actual number, millions, and then if you want to get visual of it, that's a great way to do it too. Does that sound good? Okay, cool. And then the last one is a bar graph. And bar graphs, y'all, simply using vertical or horizontal bars to show comparison. Line to show changes over. Pie to show.
Distribution.
Great. Bar to show.
Comparison.
Oh, amazing. So you could use it to show comparisons between two or more things. This one is comparing race, and it's comparing different types of elements, I guess, there. So, again, what's happening and what do we need to make sure that we point out in the comparison? Sure, these are great numbers, and they're comparing it, but what's going to be the poignant part of that? Because I believe that what they are really wanting to show in a comparison is potentially the disparity here. And by putting 34,000, in this 52, right, we can give you whatever that number is, but that number isn't on here. And that would be something that could maybe be helpful in showing the distribution or what's, in the comparison between the two, if you wanted. So by showing those differences. Also things like 0.2 and 0.6, it's fine to put on here if you wanted to. You can also round those numbers if it's not imperative that they're exactly on the dot. But I think that the important thing too is why are we comparing it? What's the number of differentiation? And simply making sure that you're pointing out what you want them to look at with that comparison and how it serves your problem, your cause, and shows that your policy is more effective, etc. Does that make sense to you? The last thing that there are these charts, and charts are great because they're just a large block of summary of information. Now, much like that of the pie chart, you're going to want to make sure that if you do have a graph that you are spending time pointing out only what you want your audience, chart, you are pointing out only what you want your audience to look at. So for example, if we had if you're looking at something like a chart where it's just bulk information listed, I've had something like this done before in even in a drunk driving speech, for example, whereby information will be placed for all the countries in the world, and then it'll compare the United States. It'll be drinking and driving deaths, or these are the amount of let's just say that drinking and driving deaths in the past year, and it'll give all the countries, and then they'll show the United States, and it'll be an exponentially larger number. And basically, they want us to see that larger number. But it doesn't make sense to point out the larger number. Obviously, we know that they are the most, but what else do you want us to look at? If we have 45 different countries on there, is that going to be important to mention all 45? No, it's also a time waste. And two, can you compare the countries to each other all evenly? No. Different laws, different rules, regulations, processes, different culture, different environment, different ways of looking at alcohol. There's so many different things. So if you wanted to point out that it has that big bulk of information, make sure that you're highlighting only those specific that are going to assist in seeing your ID more clearly. Make sure that what you're showing are and highlighting, you're making sense of. This idea also of saying percentages already, what does that look like? I don't know if that makes sense to you, but when we have something like a chart, if it's 36%, I could even use a little bit more of maybe saying dots or something, because for me 36%, and I don't even know what this is comparing, by the way, but just saying 36% of the population, I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know what those numbers are. So if you can break those down, of course, for your audience, that's always the preferred, but if we can actually show what 36% maybe percent looks like, that would also be helpful. Are you all familiar with infographics? Yeah. Infographics are a great tool. Well, yes, and infographics. Have you seen infographics at all? You can always find them really anywhere we'll do an infographic. I always grab mine from Pinterest, just FYI, or something that I looked. You could also create your own infographics, but infographics are things like this, where it tells you about how to stay connected, or this one is a lot. But oh, look, here's some ideas about sleep, and then here's the distribution of people. So this type of infographic may show a statistic a little bit different. Does that make sense to y'all? Than rather showing it in a chart form. So we could do something like 1 in 5, 66 million, etc. So just something to think about if you want to look up infographics. Again, just put in that in your search results and let us know where it comes from and breaking it down. Any questions about these charts and these graphs? Their purpose, which we know, helps listeners to visualize information. It can also help show the steps of a process or how something changed. And it always make sure to just keep those ones simple and clear. Like I said before, make sure you're pointing those out. Sound good? Okay, team. Cool. So let us then look at some of the magic. Let's look at some of the guidelines for preparing these visual aids. So make sure that you're preparing your visual aids in advance. Don't wait till the last minute. As you're going through your research, I always encourage you to start to look at information. Go back to either CQ Researcher or Opposing Viewpoints. Remember, they have charts and graphs already built out for you, so you can always look there. They also have images and different things that can help you. All of your research, I'm sure, also you've come across different charts or graphs that can help to illustrate or perchance images of what you want us to see. So keep that in mind as you go through and as you're preparing as well. Look through your speech and think what can be explained better visually or be assisted better visually. Keep visual aids simple. There is nothing worse, and this is just my example that I'm going to tell you. When you were younger, what types of visual aids would you bring in to do presentations in school? You were always on your way to Rite Aid or CVS to pick up a poster board. There is not one type of visual aid that is worse than a poster board. And let me tell you why. It literally violates every rule of visual aids, and this isn't a science fair. Science fairs or little fairs are perfect ways to put up poster boards. When individuals can come up and engage with the poster board. Why? It has tons of material on it. It has tons of images. It has all different sizes of fonts. People in the back row can certainly not see that. It also will have different colors. It will have different explanations, arrows going to different places. You should only have one idea or image up at a time is a guideline. And when we keep our visual aids simple, it allows for us to do that. We do not want multiple pictures on one slide. You don't want to show 5 pictures at the time and have us assume that we can get what you wanted us to get out of that photo. I also had somebody who would bring in 1,000,001 objects, and it was just such a hot mess because everything was a disaster by the end, and people are concentrating on the visual rather than the content that's coming up. So when you have visual aids, remember, keep them simple. The purpose is your speech, not the visual aid. It is simply there as support. So don't feel like you need to spend so much time on it. That's the other thing. Is people would spend hours on these poster boards, and I'm no, nobody's seeing this. Nobody's looking at it. Make sure visual aids are large enough. The person in the back row should be able to see your visual aid. So whatever you are showing, the person in the back should be able to see it. We couldn't simply hold something up and show it to our audience. They wouldn't be able to see that. And that's why we can typically put things either on in a mediated way, or you can also put objects up on, in any of these classrooms, up on your document camera. The document camera here, you simply put it on, and it can make anything that is small larger for each of you to see. So even something like, oh look, here I brought in this object for you all to see, but you can literally zoom in and on this. Wow. Whoa. Who would have guessed? Look at that. It's a big book, everybody. Fantastic. So make sure that we are doing that so that we can display it. So if you do have something that isn't able to go on the projector or onto the document camera, you're more than welcome to place it behind the screen if you wanted to, and then reveal it to us, again, pending that it's large enough. If not, make sure that you are maybe even taking a picture of it, a representation, and then displaying it up on the visual behind us. When we're talking about fonts, and this is just a rule of how to do things, when we were talking about something like PowerPoint, or if you wanted to put content on the material or onto your visual aid, for titles, it's a 36-inch, and then for L supporting materials, it's 28-inch. That's just a standard for us to be able to see. Use a limited number of fonts. You want to keep that to only 1 or 2 fonts, not having many different fonts, but they should have a purpose of using the 2, maybe to differentiate or perchance to show like different stages of something. That would be helpful. And then the last one is to use color effectively. We want to make sure that we're using color in effectively in a couple different ways. One, emotions can also be connected to color. I don't know if anybody has ever taken a study in art that has expressed that, or psychology, whereby we have a feeling oftentimes that will come with these colors, like why we have yellow in kitchens or blue to like spawn hunger, or why we use purple like to express royalty, or why people are like, ooh, I see a red pen and I'm so like frustrated. Oh God, you're throwing up all that red font up there. Why are you yelling at me? Right? So we could think that we did something bad, or that was a correction that needs to be made. So simply watch those things. But the other thing about color effectively is we want to make sure that people can see it and they can read it. Obviously, we would never use yellow, and I only say that because somebody has used yellow before, and we don't want to do that. But the other thing about this is that we can't assume that everybody can see color the same in our class. For example, there are people who are color impaired, right? They are colorblind, and so for them to distinguish between specific colors can be hard. So when we're thinking about things like the pie chart and you're seeing the lines of distribution, make sure that you're not putting two colors next to each other like red and green, as an individual of whom does have a color impairment may not be able to see where the differentiation starts and where it ends. So something simply to be mindful of as you go forward. Anything else in those guidelines? Just in that preparation, those general guidelines for visual aids or anything? Okay, here are the big rules, and here's how to be in front of the classroom. And this is the big one that I think that most people are looking at. So the first thing that we're going to want to know is that you don't want to use the whiteboard. And this goes for any type of class that you're giving a presentation in or anything that you're doing. In a teaching environment, it's much different because it's not necessarily like a speech in the standard platform way. But why do we want to avoid using the whiteboard? It has to do with your audience and them paying attention. First thing, what? When I turn around, Willow, now what does that give you the luxury to do? Not pay attention, check my phone, do something else, pass a note to a friend, right? So it gets you out of the way. Other than that, what happens to my voice when I turn around to the back of the room? Okay, fantastic, it does. It gets quieter. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding those two things. Also, the amount of time that it takes to write something can take time out of what you are doing. So if you do have something that you want to write on the board, it is recommended that you can write it out beforehand. And then when you are ready to reveal it, you can, of course, well, and you can't, of course, but you can walk over here because this is where the screen works. You can come on over, reveal it, talk about it, discuss it, show us what you're talking about, and then go ahead and push your screen back down. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Display visual aids where listeners can see them. So like we said, use the projector, use the overhead as much as possible. If you have an object, you can, of course, hold it up for the audience to see, but only make sure that it's large enough to be held up. Do not pass visual aids around the audience. So sorry, y'all. It's one of those things that it doesn't have a lot of a purpose and it becomes more of a distraction. Did you get this? Oh, you got it, okay. Did you get this? And you find this happening, it becomes a distraction. Then somebody sits there and they look at it while the individual is talking about what they're supposed to be looking at, but then they pass it back, and then now this person's looking at it and the speaker has moved forward. And so whatever they're looking at is now just going to simply be a distraction of what's going on. So make sure that we're not passing anything around. Can you pass things out? Yes. If you wanted to pass something out at the beginning of the class for the audience because they needed to use it eventually, it's very tricky, because if you pass it out at the beginning of the class, even if you pass out a piece of paper with a dot on it, the audience is going to look at what the whole time? And think about, well, not maybe about your presentation, but what's this dot for? I'm so excited to see this, right? So we want to make sure that we are not passing anything out that's going to be a distraction to them or simply like supplemental information that they're already hearing. So instead, you should pass out at the end if you wanted to send them home with something. Like here is like the 5 tips for a better, a healthier whatever. Here's 5 ways you can donate. Here's the online, or here's the website address for this. Here is one fantastic one that I saw once was, here is a self-addressed stamped envelope, or not a self-addressed envelope, but an odd envelope already addressed to the fund if you can put $1 in it today, you will change blank. And you can just drop it in your local mailbox right there. Just take $1 out of your pocket and put it in. It's a very effective way, but they did that at the end and they handed it out. So there's many ways to do it. I saw it done one time well in advance when a woman who was talking to us about she was a chocolatier and she made chocolate and sold it at the farmer's market. So she was talking about the process, the differentiations of chocolate. And so what she did is she packaged up like 4 different types of chocolate for each person, put it in like baggies. She had a person like pass it out at the beginning of class along with her. Said, don't eat it. We're going to be doing this taste test today, so you will be able to get around to eating it. And like each one was marked. It was like, okay, take out number 1. And then as we were chewing it, she would talk about the profile and what it was and keep us busy doing it. So it worked out really well, but you have to be sure that your audience is going to be engaged and not distracted by it. The other thing, keep visual aids up only while discussing them. This is why I said to put it into a PowerPoint if you were going to have multiple visual aids. Because you don't want to have anything up behind you that you're not referring to. So only when you're talking about it would you leave it up. Otherwise, you're going to keep the screen dark as it is now. And you don't want to have to constantly go back and maybe shift back and forth between the document cam or pull up different documents while you're up here. Putting it into one place is oftentimes easier. And then what you can do is when you are giving your presentation and you're scrolling through, you can simply scroll through the PowerPoint, and every single time you move to the next point, like just click spacebar, it goes to the blank screen, and there's a blank screen behind you. So it doesn't allow the audience to be distracted. Talk to your audience, not to your visual aid. This is something that everybody has a hard time doing because once you get that visual aid up there, they think that they need to look at it to explain it. You don't need to look at it to explain it. You do need to tell your audience what to look at. So if I am going to be focusing on my visual aid, really make sure that you are Vanna Whiting it. Remember that I can keep my attention to you and I can also point out exactly what you need to see while I'm talking to you. If I stand here and talk to you the entire time like this, it's like those individuals who simply sit there and read the PowerPoint the whole entire time. We want to make sure that we're engaged with our audience and that we can still utilize our visual aid, but don't talk to it. The good thing also about the document camera is that if you wanted to print out any of these particular graphs or charts and instead just use it on the document camera, the great part about the document camera is you don't need to walk in front. You can simply point to what you want your, sorry, it's so zoomed in. You can point to what you want your audience to look like instead. Does that make sense? And we can do it here. So make sure that we aren't doing that. And then the next one, explain clearly and concisely. Don't put a visual aid up and assume that the audience can get what it's supposed to describe. That's your job to describe it. What are we supposed to see? What are we supposed to notice? How are we supposed to understand it? And especially, how does this make more sense to your propa, everyone? Yeah, yes, absolutely. And the last thing to do is practice with your visual aids. Visual aids take time. Like they do, Amanda, they do. It takes time to walk to them. It takes time to describe them. So when people put in simply like show visual aid to their speaker's notes, it oftentimes, without practicing, it'll take more time than they anticipated. And so remember that a visual aid is going to be part of that time that you are spending in your speech, and it's counted towards that time. So how do we effectively utilize that time and not waste too much as well? Well, it goes along also with this idea of talk to your audience, not your visual aid. When people go to turn and use the space in front of their visual aid, there's a couple different things I want to make you aware of. First of all, however you decide to utilize your space, whether it be that you're going to use the podium or you're going to be using the speaker's triangle, it's up to you. But the first thing to note is that we want to be aware of our lighting as much as possible. For me to stand here like this and stand in front of the visual, not only is that, but like sometimes I'll have the image projected onto me, but also the light is on and then it creates this glare. So make sure that we're staying, of course, in front of our visual aid if we can. The other thing is that you want to make sure that you are doing what we call a walk and talk. Many students will do this. Now I'm going to show you a visual aid. What you can see here, and now we've wasted a bunch of time. The other thing is I've turned my audience, my back to the Absolutely. So there are things that you need to do. You need to set up this visual aid and you need to describe it. Maybe you need to give it some credibility. What I'm about to show you in this visual aid is going to helpfully illustrate the differentiation in numbers between the blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. So here in this first visual aid, you can start to see blah, 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 and place it out, and then we talk about it, and then we can simply walk back. And then we can walk back to our place that we were beforehand. Now, you may be saying, Amanda, what if I have multiple visual aids? This is going to be up to you, how you decide to use your space. If, let's say, you're showing your visual aid at the beginning of your speech or maybe in your first main point, you're more than welcome to deliver it here so that it makes it easier for you to use the technology, then reveal, and then once you're done, you're more than welcome to come back out, and on the next main point, you can do some type of pyramid, should you like to. If you have a lot of main points throughout your entire speech, or not, that doesn't make any sense, a lot of visual aids throughout your entire speech, it may be better for you to stay put behind a podium or stay put standing in one space only because this walking can become more of a distraction.
If you have multiple, should we do them all in a row, or is it better to spread it out?
I think that it's, again, up to your speech, whatever it needs, because we can't say, like, oh, the problems are going to need more, because we don't know, like, whatever that speech is. So there's not really a rule about it. It just depends on where you decide to put them, then that should inform how your spacing works. You're more than welcome to simply stay, of course, at the podium, regardless of anything. But if you wanted to try to get out, I think that in this class, each of you are more than capable to get out and walk, and I think that many of you are also going to find it more beneficial in your delivery style and that natural extemporaneous delivery when we do step away from the podium, because that already creates that rigidity a little bit. But again, it's whatever is most comfortable for you. You can continue to explore your own speaking style as you go forward. Sound good? Okay, cool. So let us go ahead and what we're going to do is, if you want to turn onto the back page here of the visual aids, I want to be able to go through some of the technology with you. And I'm going to have, maybe what I'll do, so I'm just going to go in like this. Look at this, everybody. So helpful. Okay. The return, so if you'll see here, turning on the computer and the projector on. That's going to be one of the requirements that I'm going to ask somebody from this class to do. If I am not in here and this thing isn't on, then go ahead and get that going and set up. What if the computer's not on? Well, don't worry. Right here, it tells you exactly all the login information that you need. It's right there on the wall. But I've also listed it out. It's basically like classroom, and then the instructor one is usually it. But down here at the bottom, there's something called the projector screen, if you'll see it. And all you're going to do is click on that projector screen and then make sure that the green button is on to make sure that it shows on. And that is going to turn on your projector. And then the screen button over here to push it up and down is on that right-hand side in the picture. So you can see it, and that will push it up and down. If you noticed, I also did it on the wall, but you're more than welcome to do it here. So that's usually getting it set up. Hopefully I will be here before you all are so that I can get this all up and running and set up. But in the event that I'm running late or something, hopefully somebody in the class can be proactive and do so. But the thing that you're going to want to note is that on any page that you want to go into, you can always access it by hitting the return button at the top. It's like the same little button there. And once you hit that return button, it's going to take you to this home screen, which you'll see in like slide 4. So the home screen has things for your PC, which is going to be for your computer. And then it has the dock cam, which will be for the dock cam down there. And you can toggle back and forth between the two simply by pushing the buttons on each of them, hitting the return, and then going back to the dock camera. Okay, and now I showed that, and now I can return it again. The important other button that you are going to notice is going to be something called the projector black button. I don't know if I wrote projector mute or projector black. So I put it that it was projector mute, but it's not. It's projector black, and it's down below the volume button there on the left-hand side. If we're looking at really any of these, you'll see that there's volume up and down, and there's something that's projector black. That's what makes this go dark. You'll always be able to see what's reflected on your own computer, but you won't be able to see it up there. So before you get started, I would set my first image, and then it's ready to go simply when you reveal it, so that you don't have to worry about pulling it up in between time. Sound good? Okay, fantastic. And then you'll also want to make sure that if you are playing a sound of something, that the volume button is all the way up. You can see there's like a little line that will go up and down to show you whether it's on or not. And then as always, you should also check it on the computer, and then also show it on, make sure that on the application that you're using, for example, if you're showing something on YouTube, that volume is also up. Now, in regard to something like showing a video, what else do I want to make you aware of? Make sure that everything is timed appropriately. So before YouTube videos, what always plays? Or most of the time? Ads. There's nothing worse than being like, and now here's that compelling moment where everything was really sad, and then it's like, juice, or whatever it is, and it changes completely, and it can take you out of the emotional field, and now people are watching a fixed 15-second advertisement. So make sure that you've run the advertisement and that you've paused it to start exactly where you want it to, and just test the volume beforehand to ensure that it's there, because there's nothing worse than be like, ooh, hold on, let me start it over, and it just seems unprepared. And then the last thing is that if you do want to try the document camera, making sure, if we can see it down here, that this button is blue, the red means it's off, blue means it's on. You can put something, making sure that this is the top and this is the bottom. Wherever the keys are down at the bottom, that's where the top bottom. You put it face up so that if you can see it, we can see it. And then you can zoom in as closely or as far away as you want to. But the best way to do it is just to come touch it. So why don't we do that? Sound good? Okay, cool.